Chapter 1. The Stain Remains. Deep beneath the trade city of Holthusen, a 5-year crusade, a relentless hunt for heretics, was finally choking on its last, desperate breath. The vast underground wine storage, a catacomb of casks and shipments of various ingredients, had become a final stand for the last remaining members of the Shattered Chalice. The campaign had ignited as a shadow war across the western Reekland, a brutal game of cat and mouse played out in small towns and hidden forest shrines. But the net had finally tightened. What was once a pervasive threat had been systematically dismantled. The heretics were hunted and driven to their main underground sanctuary, their suffocating grip on the city finally loosening after a half-decade of holding the populace in paralyzed silence. But now only a desperate handful remained, the air, almost poisonous in its stagnation and festering fermentation, had been corrupted further by chaos worship. Absolute darkness claimed the tunnels, a suffocating shroud that seemed to press physically against the eyes. Bringing a torch down here would be suicide. 5 years of neglect and dark rituals had left broken casks and alchemical abominations to bleed into the earth, filling the open air with volatile fumes until the entire cellar became a dormant bomb. A single stray spark wouldn't just start a fire. It would detonate the catacombs, turning the merchant district above into a crater of shattered cobblestones and burning timber. The local Ulrican Guard, the Brotherhood of the White Wolf, had argued violently against this approach. They demanded to seal the heavy iron blast doors and starve the heretics out, or better yet, cast a torch into the deep and let them burn, regardless of the cost to the city's foundations. But the Felidae Ore had stood firm, High Commander Kalen arguing for Sigmar's rights over indiscriminate destruction. They had won the debate in the council chambers, but they paid for it in the field. Now, the Ulricans stood guard at the surface, bitter and overruled, unwilling to crawl in the dark with Sigmar's strays. The heavy iron blast doors had closed shut hours ago, sealing the paladins in the dark for the culling. The safety of the city felt like a distant memory, replaced by the crushing pressure of the deep earth. But this is what they trained for. The Felidae Aurae were uniquely suited for this dangerous task, their feline night vision granting them a clarity in the pitch black far sharper than any human eyes. The frenzy of the initial breach had faded hours ago, leaving only the wet, suffocating silence of the aftermath. The main coven in the eastern halls was broken, their bodies being hauled to the front for cleansing. Now came the hunt for stragglers. Commander Kalen had taken the upper levels, leaving the western reserve tunnels, the deepest, most unstable veins of the complex, to Paladin Sierra for the final purification. Sierra led her group further into the underground, her boots sliding on a treacherous paste of mud, grape pulp, and fluids that had no place in a wine cellar. She stepped over the bodies of cultists without looking down. They were shells now, their souls sent to the void for final judgment. She gripped the chain of an ornate golden censer, swinging it in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It burned no coal as it swung through the air softly, scattering a cold, white, powdery smoke that cleansed the corruption and cut through the rot with the sharp, clean scent of incense. But it wasn't enough to drown out the sensory assault on her nostrils. Gods, the fumes, Sierra thought, fighting the urge to gag, a dull swimming ache starting behind her eyes. It feels like breathing wine gone violently sour. I have to fight the dizzying effect or I'll be drunk before I find another cultist. Each breath coated her tongue and throat with a volatile, burning film that tasted metallic and sharply sour, leaving her lungs reeling and her thoughts strangely sluggish, as if she were already slightly intoxicated on the pervasive ethanol. Worse than any charnel pits, this is the smell of rot made alcoholic, a cellar of poison. Water dyed a sickly brownish purple by the seepage of ancient fruit juice wept from cracks in the low ceiling. The viscous liquid dripped onto her armor with a tink, tink, tink. Each heavy drip that struck the flagstones below echoed like a metronome, marking time in this lightless underworld. Rats, unnaturally bold with alcoholic resilience, their eyes gleaming red like tiny embers in the darkness, skittered just beyond the edges of their vision, unafraid of the armed intruders. Even the vermin thrive on this alcoholic corruption. Sierra moved through the tunnel with a controlled, predatory grace honed by years of battle, a fluidity that warred constantly with the soft clanking of her Felidae Aurea plate armor. Focus one step at a time. The rot is nothing. Breathe through the mouth. Ignore the fumes. Duty. Her steel was smeared thick with streaks of sour grime, dried blood that flaked away like rust, and patches of unidentifiable organic matter. Its intricate engravings were choked with wine residue and filth, the Order's holy symbols obscured, mocking her presence here. Even my armor feels profane here, tainted by this cellar's stench. Does the blessing still hold, or does the filth seep in regardless? Her tabard, normally burnished to reflect Sigmar's light in clean white wool, was likewise soiled, a canvas of grime and gore. It was embroidered with the Order's full high crest, a stylized cat skull, half with the broken arc of Sigmar's twin-tailed comet. While all 33 members of the unit were paladins of the Felidae Aurea, blessed with the ability to knit flesh and staunch bleeding, only she, Commander Kalin, and Sir Gregor bore the title of Holy Paladin. It was a heavy distinction, marking them as direct vessels for Sigmar's will, capable of channeling true miracles where their kin could only offer triage. The others wore the red comet marking them as sworn members, but lacking the gold thread of the high rank. Sierra's protégée, Lysandra, wore a simple once-white tabard that remained blank, bearing no holy sigils, as was the custom for squires. 3 holy paladins to keep 30 souls alive in the dark, Sierra thought, feeling the faint hum of the divine connection in her blood, a stark contrast to the surrounding rot. And surrounded by a city of wolves above, who would smile if we failed. Beneath the dirty armor and layers of chainmail, hidden from this wretched place, lay the unique moon phase patterns swirled into her natural fur, the markings of her mother's heritage, unseen, irrelevant in this suffocating abyss. Sierra's pupils were wide, dilated to capture any beams of available light from the grime-caked glass windows high above the walls. The round curves of her muzzle were barely visible in the intense darkness, the scatter of white freckles across her cheeks stark against the deep black fur that slashed from the bridge of her nose to the corners of her hooded brown eyes. A few stray locks of her violet hair, the same her 4 sisters had, a mark of their mother's magical heritage, dark and heavy with sweat and fermentation, clung to her temples and forehead, framing her intense expression. Her sharp feline ears twitched constantly, rotating slightly, filtering the echo of drips and skittering claws, isolating the faint wet gurgle or distant scraping groan that might signal a remaining threat, a dying cultist or something worse lurking just beyond their sight. Stay alert. Complacency means death down here. One moment of distraction, one careless step, is all it takes. Sierra halted the advance with a sharp, clenched fist in the air, a silent command that froze her 15 felids instantly in the muck. Her eyes, narrowed to slits, fixed on a stretch of the tunnel wall that shouldn't have been moving. It rippled, not with the distortion of heat or magic, but with the subtle, cold caress of a draft. Layers of heavy wet wool, soaked with years of rot and wine mold, hung there, draped so thickly over a recessed alcove that they had become part of the shadows, a seamless darkness easily missed in the chaotic violence of the initial sweep hours ago. She turned to Lysandra, the motion fluid and deliberate. For a heartbeat, the young Philide's icy blue eyes lit up, her ears perking forward with a hungry, predatory excitement. At 20 years old, and after 2 years of sparring and being made to recite Tenei after Teneti, Lysandra was desperate to prove herself in combat. She had spent the last 6 hours of the purge relegated to the rear guard, watching the backs of the veteran Phalids, while the sounds of glory echoed ahead of her. She took a step forward, her hand drifting to her sword hilt, clearly thinking this was finally her moment to be the vanguard. But the light in her eyes died instantly, replaced by a flash of deep betrayal as Sayera didn't gesture for her to advance. Instead, the paladin began to unwind the golden chain of the censer from her forearm, where it was coiled tight like a warrior's rosary to secure the swing. She loosened the golden links and softly looped it into the squire's hands. The chain clinked softly, a sound like a prison door locking. "Not yet, my sister," Sayera thought, seeing the hurt on the girl's face. "You have speed, but you lack the blessing. I know not what waits behind that curtain." Sayera knew the tactical reality. The breach was too narrow. Only one of them could fit through the gap at a time, and whatever waited on the other side would strike the first thing it saw. Sayera bore the heavy plate of a holy paladin and the divine protection of Sigmar's favor. Lysandra wore only a half set of armor and the eagerness of youth. If they walked into a trap, Sayera would likely bruise, Lysandra would bleed. She spoke no words, the command for absolute silence communicated in the sharp tilt of her head and the intensity of her gaze. Lysandra took the chain, the weight of the holy vessel settling in her hands like a punishment, her expression tight with suppressed energy, her eyes darting hungrily and resentfully to the hidden entrance. Sayera reached over her shoulder, unhooking the massive two-handed warhammer from her back. She leaned it silently against a fermentation barrel, feeling the relief of its weight leaving her spine. In a space that tight, a wide swing would be suicide, shattering stone and leaving her exposed. Instead, her gloved hand drifted to her belt, fingers curling around the cold leather grip of a long, thin misericord, a blade meant for close quarters and quick endings, assigned to all paladins for the coup de grace. The bulk of the cultists had thrown themselves at the paladin lines in a suicidal frenzy the moment the blast doors sealed. Anyone hiding this deep for this long was not a warrior. They were either a coward hoping to survive the purge, or a sacrifice waiting to complete it. She reached out, pushing aside the heavy, stinking cloth, the fibers slimy and wet. She stepped through the archway, her feline eyes instantly adjusting to the gloom, pupils expanding to drink in the scant light. The air inside was different, thicker, sharper. But it was the sudden silence that made her fur stand on end. As the heavy sopping wool fell back into place behind her, it sealed the alcove like a cork. The layers of wet, dense fabric acted as an acoustic dampener, an isolation chamber that instantly cut off the rhythmic metronome of dripping water and the reassuring presence of the main tunnel. She couldn't hear the breathing of her squad or the clink of Lysandra's chain anymore. A cold realization settled in her gut. If the sound was cut off this cleanly for her, they probably couldn't hear her either. She was truly alone in the box. Her focus narrowed, filtering out the ringing silence to lock onto the only sound left, the ragged, wet breathing of a man backed into a corner, hyperventilating in the dark. He wasn't what she expected. The men they had been butchering for the last 6 hours wore the crimson and blue robes of the shattered chalice, marked with sigils of the Changer scarred into their flesh. But this man was human, small and frail compared to her kin, dressed in the heavy stained leather apron of a winemaker. He looked less like a combatant and more like a vessel used and discarded. His tunic was soaked, his skin pale and clammy, and his mouth was stained a deep, bruising purple that trailed down his neck, the look of a man who had been force-fed the tainted vintage. He was curled against a stack of rotting barrels, his knees pulled to his chest, shaking uncontrollably. His hands were white-knuckled, clutching two rough gray stones against his chest, as if they were talismans of comfort in the dark. What caught Sierra's eye was the ragged strip of linen wrapped tightly around his eyes, the fabric soaked through with tears that ran down his cheeks in dark, purple streaks, like the wine from his cheeks. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a broken thing, a worker trapped in the dark when the doors sealed, driven mad by the fumes and the fear. He was shivering violently, muttering strings of numbers and nonsense into his chest. Sierra hesitated, the slim golden dagger lowering slightly in her grip. A laborer, a victim left behind in the chaos. Her eyes swept the cramped alcove, piercing the shadows behind the barrels. Empty. No ambush, no other breaths, just this broken, blind workman. She reached back through the heavy curtain, her hand visible to the squad waiting in the tunnel. She made a sharp, chopping gesture with her hand, peeking through the gap her arm made. Sacrifice. Secure perimeter. Move on. From the other side of the wall, she watched their silhouettes move away, disciplined soft clinking of armor as her unit stepped back, obeying the command to leave her to the grim work of mercy or anti-corruption healing, something she, as the only holy paladin nearby, could offer the man. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. Sierra sheathed the misericord, a calculated risk. Protocol dictated that a weapon remain drawn until the subject was verified pure. But fear was a volatile element in a place like this. A drawn blade could turn a cowering victim into a cornered animal, sparking a panic she didn't need. She stepped forward slowly, her movements telegraphing harmlessness, her voice dropping to a soft, maternal register, a tone she reserved for the shell-shocked survivors pulled from the wreckage of war. "Peace, citizen," she purred, the sound vibrating in her chest. She kept her hands open and visible, palms up, though she knew he could not see them through the blindfold. It was a gesture for her own peace of mind as much as his. "The fighting is over. The purge is complete. You are safe now. The order is here." The reaction was instant and wrong. The man went rigid, his shivering ceasing as if a switch had been flipped. His head didn't turn, naturally. It snapped toward her with the unnatural, jerky speed of a marionette, the stained linen blindfold facing her like a grotesque, eyeless stare. "A woman," the whisper scraped out of his throat, hoarse and confused. "The wolves of Ulrich keep no bitches in their pack. I smell incense, not the wet dog musk." Sierra stopped dead. A cold prickle of warning, primal and sharp, ran down her spine, raising the fur on her arms. Her hand drifted back toward her belt, abandoning the maternal warmth. Her Sigmar blessing coursed adrenaline through her as she felt something was horribly wrong. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hardening. The man tilted his head, sniffing the air like a hound. The purple tears leaking from beneath the rag weren't just flowing, they were shimmering. In the absolute dark of the alcove, they glowed with a faint, sick bioluminescence, dripping onto his hands like liquid starlight. He wasn't crying wine, he was weeping raw, unrefined magic. "Not gray?" he muttered, his fingers twitching in the muck at his feet, tracing patterns in the sludge that hurt the eye to follow. "Gold. I see the gold shining in the dark, blinding, burning." judging. He sees me, Sierra realized, a jolt of horror punching through her discipline. He is blind to the world, but he sees the soul. It was a violation of the natural order, a mutation of sight granted by the Changer. She had made a tactical error, a fatal one. She had dismissed her Felids, thinking she was granting mercy to a broken invalid, and instead she had locked herself in a closet with a conduit. "The Ulricans are not here," Sierra said, her voice hardening into steel as she stepped 1 inch closer, measuring the distance for a strike. The movement was muscle memory, but her mind was reeling. She was standing inches from a conduit of chaos, alone, in the dark, engaging in conversation rather than combat. It was a violation of every survival instinct she possessed, a flagrant disregard for the safety of her soul. Yet, she couldn't strike. Not yet. A gnawing magnetic pull in her gut, perhaps the very intuition Kaelin despised, demanded answers. "You face the Felidae Aurae." A strange, wet laugh bubbled up from the man's throat, a sound like wine fermenting in a sealed cask. It wasn't a laugh of defeat, but of delirious, terrifying revelation. "The Weaver, he plays tricks even on us. The trap was set for the dogs. We were meant to bleed the wolves of Ulrich here. That was the design." Sierra felt the skin on her arms prickle. She had killed dozens of his kin today. They had charged with wild abandonment, screaming praise to their dark gods as they impaled themselves on paladin blades. They sought death as a reward. But this one had waited. "Why are you hiding?" Sierra demanded, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The deviation from protocol tasted sour in her mouth. She should be reciting the rite of finality, not interrogating a madman. "Your brethren died hours ago. They sought glory in the blade. You huddled in the dark behind a curtain. Why?" He turned his head as if listening to a whisper Sierra couldn't hear, the blindfold twitching. "I did not hide, Golden One. I waited. The trap requires patience. The wolves, they are blunt instruments, heavy, predictable. We needed their blood to soak the earth, to prime the vein." His grin widened, exposing purple-stained teeth. "But you walked into the wrong trap, Paladin. This grave was dug for lesser men. But oh, Tzeentch provides. You are a much bigger prize." "The chalice is broken," Sierra countered, her voice tight. She watched his hands, seeing the tension in his knuckles. She had never been this close to one who hadn't tried to kill her instantly. It made him feel less like a monster and more like a poisonous snake coiled to strike. "Your cult is dead. There is no prize here." He speaks of chaos, madness, Sierra thought, her mind racing. But if I listen with holy ears, maybe I can see the wider web. "We are but one of many who seek the same fate," he spat, his head twitching violently, spraying a fine mist of purple fluid. "Your vessel is waiting. The butcher, he waits at the bowl. We were to drown the wolves in wine, but you? The golden cats, pure souls? Oh yes, he will feast. You are a far rarer vintage, but if I take you now, would it anger the Changer, or would it grant me the prize?" Sierra froze, the hairs on her neck standing straight up. The air felt heavy. She was bargaining with madness. Every second she delayed the strike was a heresy against her training, yet the mention of a trap, a specific designed trap for her order, froze her hand. "What butcher?" she demanded, her voice tight with a rising panic she refused to show. "What bowl are you speaking of? Where is this trap?" The deep scar, the cultist hissed, the words dripping with a reverence that made him shudder. "The village swallowed by the earth, where the sun dies early and the moon's sickness breathes. The cradle of stone." He leaned forward, the blindfold facing her like a black mirror. He creates the apotheosis there. He will grind your bones to make his ladder to the gods. Sayera's heart hammered against her ribs. A village swallowed by the earth. It sounded like a prophecy, but the specificity of it sounded like geography. He wasn't speaking in riddles, he was giving coordinates. Where? She pressed, stepping closer, violating the last shred of her safety protocols. Give me the name. He laughed, a wet, sickening sound that bubbled into a dark epiphany. 2 threads, spinning at once. The weaver plays multiple games on the same board. The butcher works his slow art in the cradle of stone, while we were granted the harvest here. He paused, his head cocking to the side as if arguing with a treacherous whisper from the changer himself. The wolves were the intended sacrifice. The grey ones, arrogant in their furs and leather, they would have bled. Our knives would have found purchase where your gold denied us. We would have piled their corpses in the dark hours ago. His trembling hands steadied. The fear evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, greedy clarity. But the weaver sent me something better. You survived our traps because of your shells of steel, but now they will be your folly. He grinned, a horrific expression beneath the blindfold. Why let the butcher claim the favor? Why let him ascend on the slow suffering of peasants when I have the Golden Order right here? 33 paladins, sealed in a casket of stone and spirits. I don't need his ritual. I can steal the ascension right now. No, Sayera breathed, seeing the shift from servitude to ambition. Suddenly, his hands shot up from the muck. The talismans he clutched were not for comfort. They were jagged pieces of flint, and he hovered them dangerously over a puddle of high-proof spirits pooling at his feet. I don't need his valley, he whispered, the purple tears flowing faster. I don't need his ritual. If I spark this, I steal the prize. I become the ladder. Tzeentch rewards the one who acts, not the one who waits. If you spark that, Sayera said, her voice dropping low, forcing calm over her terror, you die screaming in fire. Your god grants immortal flesh to the worthy, not to charred corpses. There is no ascension in ash. Give me the stones, tell me of this butcher, and you will face a clean trial. The cultist hesitated, the fear of fiery death warring with his ascension to his patron. He sees the change. He knows you are coming now. The threads have retied. Movement at the curtain caught their attention as the room blasted with sound. It wasn't a shadow detaching from the dark, but a heavy golden blur hurtling through the air. The iron censer Sayera had entrusted to her squire flew through the wool curtain behind her, the chain trailing behind it like a whip. It struck the rotting barrel inches from the cultist's head with a deafening clang, shattering its casing and erupting in a blinding cloud of cold, white purification powder. Sayera recoiled, throwing her steel-plated arm over her face as the blessed chalk filled the cramped alcove. She choked, the fine dust coating her throat and stinging her eyes, momentarily blinding her. At 7 feet of plate steel and muscle, Sayera was a fortress in the small room, occupying nearly all the available space. Yet in the white-out haze, something small and terrifyingly fast found a gap that shouldn't have existed. "Get away from her!" a voice shrieked high and wild with adrenaline. Lysandra burst through the heavy curtain, a blur of black fur and unbridled rage. Standing barely 5 feet tall, the squire was dwarfed by her mentor's imposing silhouette, but she used that small stature like a weapon. She moved with a velocity that made Sayera look like a statue, darting under the paladin's guard and through the swirling dust with the agility of a jungle cat. She had crept back, disobeying orders, terrified that the long silence meant her mentor was succumbing to the whispers of the dark. She had heard the bargaining. She had heard the threat to the order. She didn't possess the heavy plate momentum of a paladin, nor the reach of a warrior born to the high bloodlines. She launched herself into the small room, clearing the distance in a fraction of a second, and hit the cultist with the focused force of a cannonball, slamming her small, half-armored body into his chest. The impact drove the air from the man's lungs in a wet whoosh. He collapsed backward into the muck, his arms flailing. The flint stones flew from his grip, disappearing into the dark, alcoholic slurry with a harmless plop. "Hold him!" Sayera shouted, coughing violently, her vision swimming in the white haze. She lunged forward, trying to find them in the dust. "Lysandra, hold him! We need him alive!" The cloud of blessed chalk swirled violently around them, a miniature storm trapped in the alcove. As the white dust began to settle, coating Lysandra's obsidian fur in a ghostly rime, she straddled the man's chest. Her knees drove down with bruising force into his arms, pinning him to the filth-slicked floor. She leaned over him as her lips peeled back in a grimace that transcended anger, revealing elongated canines in a snarl that was entirely feral. Her eyes swimming with a terrifying mixture of panic, devotion, and raw bloodlust. Behind them, Sayera stumbled, one hand gripping a wine rack for support as she hacked, her lungs seizing from the inhalation of the concentrated salts. Dust that never had this effect on her before. She clawed at her face with a gauntleted hand, trying to wipe the stinging grit from her eyes to see the scene clearly. "Lysandra," Sayera wheezed, her voice raspy and desperate, forcing her watering eyes to focus on the blur of motion on the floor. "Hold him. He speaks of a trap, another ritual." The cultist lay breathless and broken beneath the squire, his chest heaving in shallow, wheezing hitches where the impact had likely cracked ribs. Yet, he didn't beg. He didn't flinch at the young Felid looming over him like an executioner. Instead, a slow, wet smile spread across his face. "The architect has already drawn the design," he rasped, the words bubbling up through a throat clogged with blood and conviction. The sound was wet and thick, a gurgle of lungs filling with fluid. He gathered a mouthful of purple-tainted phlegm, his throat working convulsively, and spat it directly into Lysandra's face with his dying breath. "You are just ink on the page. He will unmake you all." The warm, toxic spittle hit her cheek, sliding down into her fur, thick and clinging. It was the catalyst. Something inside Lysandra shattered into jagged shards of pure instinct. The agonizing hours of being held back in the rear guard, the terror of watching Sayera speak calmly to a monster in the dark, the overwhelming fear that her mentor was being seduced by the very chaos they swore to destroy, coalesced into a singular, blinding point of violence that bypassed all reason. "Silence!" Lysandra screamed, the word tearing from her throat. She didn't reach for the clean steel of her own misericord. Her hand scrambled blindly in the muck and closed around a loose stave from the broken barrel, a jagged, heavy piece of oak. She raised the wood high, the damp timber dripping onto her face, and she drove it down. It wasn't a clean kill. The wood slammed into the man's throat, shattering the cartilage with a wet, sickening resonance that echoed in the cramped space. The cultist gagged, a final choked sound, but Lysandra didn't stop. "Heretic!" she shrieked, the word a frantic prayer as she raised the stave again. She brought it down hard on his chest, the heavy oak pulverizing ribs and driving the air from his ruined lungs. The man's body convulsed beneath her, his legs kicking out uselessly in the muck. But she pinned him tighter, her weight anchoring him to his death. "Deceiver!" She hammered him again, grunting with the effort, turning the man's ribcage into a concave ruin of meat and bone splinters. Blood sprayed across her face in hot, sticky arcs, mixing with the white powder to create a grotesque pink paste on her black fur. There was no technique here, no combative grace. It was the frantic, terrified violence of a child, destroying a spider that had crawled too close, fueled by a zealotry that bordered on madness. Sigmar judges you, burn in the void. Sierra wiped the last of the grit from her eyes, blinking rapidly as her vision finally snapped into focus. The scene that greeted her froze the breath in her lungs. The room was no longer dark, it was painted in shades of violent red. Her squire was unrecognizable, a blur of motion and gore, pounding the life out of a corpse that had stopped moving seconds ago. By the comet. The thought hit Sierra like a physical blow. This wasn't justice. This was butchery. It was the exact lack of discipline the Order warned against. The raw, uncontrolled fury that led straight to the corruption they fought. "Lysandra!" Sierra roared, the sound magnified in the small space. The squire ignored her. She raised the stave again, preparing to strike a skull that was already fractured. Sierra moved, charging and closing the distance in 2 heavy strides. She reached out, her gauntleted hand closing around the back of Lysandra's leather cuirass like a vice. With a grunt of effort, she hauled the squire backward, ripping her off the body with enough force to send them both stumbling. Lysandra tensed, her knees sliding in the blood-slicked mud, the bloody stave still clutched in her hand. She looked at Sierra with wild, unseeing eyes, her chest heaving and her teeth bared like a feral cat. "He threatened," she gasped, her voice high and breathless, desperate to justify the carnage. Crack. The sound of the backhanded slap was louder than the killing blow had been, a sharp, wet report that echoed violently in the small alcove. Sierra didn't even register the strike on her own squire as she felt her arm tense. Her steel knuckle plates connected with Lysandra's jaw and cheek with the force of a siege hammer. The impact was brutally fast. Lysandra's head snapped to the side with a sickening pop of vertebrae, her vision whitening out instantly. Her feet found purchase on the ground, and she slid across the floor, her boots leaving a path in the filth. It wasn't discipline, it was a release of pure, unadulterated rage. Lysandra's hand flew up to her cheek, the bruising underneath the fur already hot with throbbing pain. She blinked, and for the first time since the frenzy began, her eyes cleared, filling with water. Hot tears of humiliation and shock welled in the corners, spilling over to mix with the blood and grime on her face. She looked up at her mentor, her expression a shattered mosaic of betrayal and petulance. "I told you to hold him," Sierra screamed, her throat raw from the powder still clinging to the air. She loomed over the smaller Felid, her shadow swallowing her. "He had information. He was giving us the location." "He spoke heresy," Lysandra shouted back, her voice cracking as she scrambled to her feet, wiping the tears and blood onto her breeches with a trembling hand. "Witch Hunter Richter taught me the first rule of the hunt. Never listen to the whispers of chaos. They only speak to corrupt. You were listening, Sierra. You let him taint the air with his words. I saved you." "You blinded us," Sierra roared, her fists tensing as she felt adrenaline build to a fever pitch in her body. "I was extracting intelligence. We are not witch hunters. We are paladins of the Golden Order. We do not slaughter indiscriminately because we are afraid of words." "I wasn't afraid." Lysandra pulled back, knocking Sierra's hands away with a snarl. "I was finishing the mission. He said he would steal the Ascension. He said he would kill us all. I ended the threat while you stood there debating with a monster. And now we know nothing." Sierra stepped into her space, forcing the squire back against the wood. "We know there is a trap. We know there is a butcher. But thanks to your zeal, we don't know where and we don't know when. You didn't save me, squire. You just ensured that whatever happens next is a surprise." "What is happening here?" The voice was deep, firm, cutting through the heat of the argument like a glacier calving into the sea. Commander Kalen filled the doorway, his massive silhouette blocking out what little light filtered in from the main tunnel. His armor scraped against the stone frame, a metallic shriek that demanded attention. His lion-feeled heritage made him a bulwark of nobility, the golden honey fur standing stark and clean, despite the grime and gore. Behind him, the glowing eyes of his half of the squad reflected the faint, lingering haze of the censer powder, silent witnesses to the shame of the Western Reserve of the wine cellar. He looked at the dead cultist, a ruin of meat and bones sinking into the filth. He looked at the shattered barrel, and finally his sharp eyes settled on Sierra's shaking hands and the patch of matted, disordered fur on Lysandra's face. "The threat is neutralized, Commander," Lysandra said quickly, snapping to attention despite the tears streaking her face. Her chest heaved with adrenaline, but her voice carried the desperate conviction of the position the commander had over them all. He attempted to ignite the room. He had flints. I silenced him. He was disarmed, Sierra spun on her superior, desperate to control the narrative before the silence damned her. "Kaelin, listen to me. He spoke of a trap. He said the Ulricans were the intended target here, but that a butcher in a valley, a place where the sun dies early, waits for a bigger prize. He claimed there is a ritual." Kaelin walked over to the corpse. He nudged the shattered ribcage with a steel-toed boot, verifying death with the casual indifference of a butcher inspecting a side of beef. He turned slowly, his gaze heavy with exhaustion and disdain. "A valley," Kaelin scoffed, the sound echoing flatly in the damp room. "Is that the intelligence you risked my unit for? A riddle from a dying madman?" "He was specific," Sierra pressed, stepping forward. "He said the Weaver plays two games. He said we walked into the wrong trap." "We walked into the trap we were paid to walk into, Sierra," Kaelin snapped, his voice dropping an octave, dangerous and low. "The Merchants Guild paid for Holthusen to be safe. They paid for the wine cellars to be cleared so commerce could resume. Look around you." He gestured vaguely at the carnage. "The cellars are cleared. The guild is safe. The coin is secure. That is the mission. That is the only reality that matters." Sierra felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't the first time Kaelin had equated their holy duty with the weight of gold, but it had never been this blatant. "We are paladins of Sigmar, not mercenaries for the guild. If there is a threat moving beyond the city—" "There is always a threat moving beyond the city," Kaelin roared, stepping into her personal space, his height towering hers, his presence overwhelming. "That is the world we live in. But we are here. We are in Holthusen. And you stood in a room saturated with explosive fumes and debated philosophy with a flint-wielding maniac. You risked the entire contract and 33 lives because you wanted to have a conversation." "I was doing my duty," she spat back. "Your duty was to purge." Kaelin pointed a gauntleted finger at her chest, knocking the comet emblem hard enough to make a ringing sound. "You hesitated. And then—" His eyes shifted to Lysandra, lingering on the matted fur and the raw skin peeking through on her cheek. "And then you lost control. You struck your own squire in the field. You're fraying, Sierra. You're emotional, reckless, and dangerous." "I struck her because she disobeyed a direct order," Sierra argued, though the heat was leaving her voice, replaced by a dawning dread. "She acted," Kaelin corrected, his voice turning smooth, almost reasonable. "She saw a threat you were ignoring, and she ended it, with zeal, with efficiency. She protected you. All of us." He turned to the squire. "Come here, girl." Lysandra hesitated, glancing at Sierra, then walked to the commander's side. She kept her head down, but the defiance in her posture remained. "Get out, Sierra," Kaelin said, not looking at her. "You're a mess. You're compromised. Go topside, scrub the filth off and drill your tenets. You're relieved of duty for the day." The shame hit her harder than any physical blow. To be sent away like a novice in the middle of a deployment was a stain on her honor that would take years to scrub out. I am a holy paladin of the Order. And you're a liability today. Kalen cut her off, his voice final. He placed a heavy hand on Lysandra's shoulder, claiming her. I'm taking the squire. She seems to understand that when a snake hisses, you cut off its head. She's with me until you remember how to follow protocol. Maybe a rotation with my vanguard will teach her the discipline you clearly failed to instill. Lysandra didn't look at Sierra. She just nodded to Kalen. Sierra stood in the dark, her chest heaving, the taste of vinegar and betrayal thick in her mouth. She looked at Kalen, seeing for the first time the glint of something other than duty in his eyes. Avarice, a hunger for control that she had been too blind to see. She looked down at the iron censer lying in the mud, the holy smoke sputtering out. It felt heavy, useless to attempt to gather it. Fine, she spat as she turned on her heel, shoving past Kalen and his squad without a salute. She stormed out of the alcove, leaving the censer behind in the muck. As she crossed the threshold back into the main tunnel, the stinging in her eyes finally ceased. The holy dust no longer burned. The warning was gone, replaced by a cold, numb void. She grabbed her main weapon she had left against the barrels, something that would have brought her the reach she needed in that small space, without Lysandra's help to disarm the man. As she marched through the gloom of the main artery, away from the scene of her failure, the words echoed in her mind. The coin is secure, not the souls, not the city's spirit, just the coin. Was that all it was to him now? A matter of efficiency and payment. The physical reek of the cellar felt less violating than the spiritual stain of witnessing such brutality dismissed as zeal. Sierra felt a cold knot form in her stomach. If she avoided Kalen's hollowness was the only alternative to give in to the rage? To chase efficiency with ecstatic fury until the line between paladin and cultist blurred into nothing? The thought was a chilling betrayal of everything she had dedicated her life to. She drew a ragged breath, the sour alcoholic air coating her lungs with the stench of decay. She was leaving the tunnels, ordered to the surface like a scolded child. But the darkness seemed to cling to her armor. The stain remained, pervasive and insidious, threatening to seep into the cracks of her soul. It was her sacred, terrible duty to hold it back, to ensure it didn't consume them all. But as she reached the stairs leading up to the city streets, a cold resolve hardened beneath the shame. The cultist's words, the cradle of stone, the sun dies early, weren't just the ramblings of a dying madman. They were a countdown. Kalen might be content to secure the guild's contract and ignore the horizon. But Sierra could still feel the phantom heat of the explosion that didn't happen. The Weaver was playing a second game, and the board was already set somewhere else. Let him have the squire. Let him have the gold, she thought, her claws digging into her palms inside her gauntlets until the pain grounded her. I will not let the sun die in that valley. I will find out what is happening in the deep scar, and I will stop it before it's too late. But hold fast, she recited silently, a desperate prayer against the void. Hold fast to the light even when the shadows press so close. Do not let this place break you. Do not become what you fight.